Hi, welcome to our last lesson of the unit. Today's lesson is about biodiversity. Our essential question for today is, why is biodiversity important? Now for our first question. What do you think bio means? And what do you think diversity means? I hope you answered that bio means life. We've kind of talked about this in class before already. And diversity means variety. So biodiversity means a variety of life. Now for our next question. There are two food webs, one on the left, one on the right. They both have populations of mice. Which food web or ecosystem would be least affected by the extinction of the mice? The food web and ecosystem on the left, or the food web and ecosystem on the right? I hope you answered the one on the right. The food web on the right would be least affected by the extinction of the mice. The reason why, if you take a look right here, right, the mice population, yes, it does feed the 3 apex predators in here. However, all of the 3 apex predators in here also have many other sources of food. Whereas if you look in this population or this food web on the left, we have the mouse population that is feeding 3 of the predators in this population, one of which is feeding the apex predator as well, and only has this one singular source of food, which are the mice. So if the mice were to go extinct in this food web, you can tell that the snakes would go extinct as well, and that would severely affect the owl population, or they would overhunt the shrew population and the rabbit population. So you can tell in this food web on the left, it's not very stable, right? You can even call, if we were to review a little key term here, you would even call this mouse a keystone species, right? It's holding up the whole ecosystem. Whereas on the right ecosystem and food web, we don't have that same situation. That mouse, yes, it does serve a role, but that role is filled by many other different organisms and species in that food web. So, as we said before, bio means life, diversity means variety. So why is biodiversity important? One of the main things that biodiversity gives us is environmental stability. As you saw earlier, one of those ecosystems wasn't as stable as the other. When one species went missing in the first ecosystem on the left, it very quickly collapsed, right? Whereas the ecosystem that was on the right, now on the bottom, that ecosystem was a lot more stable. So even when one species disappeared, the ecosystem had a lot of replacements or other species that could serve the same role. But of course, humans were selfish. So what do we as humans get from biodiversity? What do you guys think we get from nature? Answer the question for me. These are some of the things that we get from nature. Hopefully you answered some things here. Maybe food, maybe water. We get oxygen, right? We need that to survive, right? We get medicine. We get a lot of different types of medicine from nature. Aesthetics, how things look, and ideas. If you look at the right here, we have a lot of ideas that have been given to us by nature. For example, we have this robot dog that has been seen on the internet in different forms, right? We have this car, this concept right here, which was designed by Mercedes many years ago, which was based on this fish right here, interestingly enough, because this fish was boxy, which is good for storing things and holding things, but also had a very low, what we call drag coefficient, which means that it moves through the water very well. And if it moves through water very well, it would be similarly be able to move through air very well, which is what this van and minivans subsequently were based off of this idea right here. This brings us to the three components of biodiversity. The three components, you can think of them as rules or requirements for an ecosystem to have biodiversity. So for an ecosystem to have biodiversity, diversity of life, one of the first things is diversity of genes. Genes are our DNA. So if you look around this classroom right now, you have all the same species. We're all human. However, we all have very different genes, which is very important for the survival of any species, is to have different genes. One example here, if you take a look, we have some dogs, right? We have this breed right here, which are beagles. We have the corgis, we have the shibas. They all are canines, they all are dogs. However, they all have different genes, which is actually beneficial for the species as a whole. One thing you've noticed with dogs that are purebred, and if we're speaking specifically one breed, you'll notice that they have sometimes a lot of specific genetic problems that pop up quite often, and it's the same genetic problems, and it's because they don't have a diversity in genes. The next component is the diversity of species. This one's pretty straightforward. The more species you have, the more diversity you have. If you remember that food web from earlier, the food web that had more species in it was more biologically diverse, and it was more stable, right? It had more organisms, more species serving the same roles in that ecosystem. So if one species were to become diseased and maybe die out, other species could replace or fulfill their roles. Our last component is diversity of ecosystems. Now with ecosystems, that's a little bit different, right? It's not a living thing necessarily, but in our planet, not only are we thinking about ecosystems on their own, but we have so many different ecosystems around the world that provide us with so many different things. So in order for our world to be stable, we also want a diversity of ecosystems and habitats as well. Now there are threats to biodiversity. There are things that make it hard for biodiversity to thrive. One of those things is species extinction, of course. If you go back to one of our three components, right, diversity of species, this is basically the opposite of that, right? As species go extinct, we lose species. As we lose species, we lose diversity in species. Hence, diversity or variety goes down, right? If you think about the word variety, if you go to, I don't know, a shoe store, right, and they don't have a certain model of shoe, then the variety goes down. Same thing with species. The diversity goes down if species go extinct, right? Earth is losing as many as 3 per hour. And this is oftentimes, and this is probably a pretty conservative estimate, because nowadays with climate change being drastically stronger, we're probably losing more species. When species go extinct though, many species can be affected. So that is a negative impact of that. Another threat to biodiversity is habitat destruction. So that brings us to our next question. What might be some examples of habitat destruction? Here we go. Examples. Hopefully you came up with some of these. You probably thought of deforestation, right? Maybe even like pollution, right? But deforestation is cutting down trees. Pretty straightforward, okay? Oftentimes we do that to create places for us to live. That leads to urbanization, right? Urbanization is basically when we are creating urban environments for people to live in, cities, suburbs, things like that. Farming. Farming is where we remove a lot of what is the natural vegetation in order to grow one single plant. One single plant is one species, so there's no diversity there. Oftentimes, it's also a lack of diversity in genes. So you see a couple examples here in the pictures, right? Right here on the top, you see a banana plantation. Did you know that in order to create more banana trees, all we do is chop off a branch, take that branch, stab it in the ground, and let it grow. And that's a new tree. It's an exact clone of the previous trees. So all those banana trees are basically twins. They're all identical. So there's no diversity of genes either. And when we plant other types of crops, there's also very little diversity in the genes. Because if you think about it, we want our food to look the same. We want our food to be predictable no matter where you buy it. So in order to do that, there has to be very little diversity, very little variety, or else it becomes a different product. So because of that, when we grow food, there's also very little diversity in genes as well. So that's farming. And lastly, habitat fragmentation. As we create roads, as we create cities and things like that, we start to fragment or break apart the natural ecosystems that are out there. And it makes it harder for animal populations to survive. Here's some examples of urbanization, right? You can see we have suburban urbanization and urban urbanization. Here's an example of deforestation, right? We can see right here we've cut down a bunch of different trees. This is actually a picture of the rainforest, where they cut down these trees just to grow palm oil. And here's an example of habitat fragmentation. So we have this long highway that is dangerous for animals to cross. And we've created a few of these. Most recently, one opened up in LA. These are called like wilderness bridges, or they have different names. But basically, it's for animals to cross, find a safe place to cross so that they can cross these dangerous roads. And they work to some extent. But if you're an animal that's like 2 miles down the road over here, or maybe a mile down, you might not think to go all the way down, cross over, and then go all the way back to where you're trying to get to, right? So there's only so much that these things can help do. And then, of course, pollution, right? Pretty straightforward. Land pollution, air pollution, water pollution. We'll get into that a little bit more in another unit. And climate change. Planet's getting warmer. Because of that, a lot of things are changing, right? Again, we'll get into that in another unit. Okay, here are some examples. This was in a drought during the 2012-2013 year, and then leading into the 2014 year. There's a lake on the left, and you can see the same lake on the right. You can see this clump of trees right here is the same clump of trees right here on the right. Okay. California, these are all pictures from California. California goes through this quite often. Currently, we're actually very fortunate where we had a lot of rain recently, but we don't know how long that's going to last in terms of the water reserves. All right, here's one bridge on the left. It's the same bridge on the right. A bridge on the left, same bridge on the right. Okay, so climate change is a big factor, but that's definitely something we're going to be exploring a lot more later on. The last one is introduced or invasive species. This is a species that is brought into an ecosystem by humans. This could be accidental, purposeful. Invasive species can have an environmental and economical impact. So that's one thing that, you know, environmental impact, that's bad. Economical impact, people need to think about that as well, right? Like I said, humans are kind of selfish. If it affects the environment, maybe not that big of a deal. If it affects us economically, corporations will start to pay attention. And another problem is invasive species often push out native species by sometimes either preying upon them or outcompeting them. This brings us to our next question. What are some examples of plants or animals that shouldn't be where they are being found? Hopefully you found some examples, but I'll give you some as well. Here is what we call the Burmese python. Okay, the Burmese python, as you can tell from the name, is originally from Burma, but it's kind of a cool looking snake and stuff like that, and it can grow pretty large, so it was kind of a cool exotic pet to have for a while until they got too big. Some people in Florida thought, well, they're kind of from the swampy area. Why don't I just throw it back out into the swamp in the Everglades in Florida? And a lot of people did this. And the next thing we knew, we have this huge population of Burmese pythons in the Everglades, and they're breeding. They're not just like single individuals here and there, but they're actually breeding with each other. And now they have this huge population of invasive species Burmese pythons in the Everglades. Plants can be invasive species as well. On the right here, you have this kudzu plant. This is a plant that people brought over because it grew pretty fast. It was nice and green and leafy and looked nice, but then it went out of control. If you've ever been fortunate enough to go to Hawaii, you'll notice that they are very careful about letting plants in and out because they've had issues with plants before. So they're very careful about letting plants from the mainland, from the 48 contiguous states, into Hawaii. And they also don't want you taking their plants out of Hawaii because some of the plants that survive in Hawaii might not be very welcome in different ecosystems around the world. So they try to very much control what comes in and out plant-wise as well. So plants can be invasive species also, which is kind of interesting. And here is our last one, last example. This is what we know as the European mouse. And if you know a little bit of European history, right, the Europeans kind of just sailed all over the world and kind of settled everywhere and colonized everywhere. And along with their ships, as they went around the world, they traveled around the world, they brought mice with them. These mice were not on every continent, but now they are, because humans brought them with them. Accidentally, not on purpose, but they brought them with them. And now they're everywhere, and they're also technically considered an invasive species. Here's an example of how invasive species have affected different species. This bird you see here, this is a dodo bird. This dodo bird is now extinct. Humans went and discovered this species off an island off of Madagascar, as you can see right there. And we brought with us not only mice and rats, which ate their eggs, but also cats and dogs, which would eat the birds. And these birds, they're flightless birds. You can tell kind of by their wing right there. They can't fly very well, right? They don't fly at all, right? So their nests are on the ground because they didn't have any natural predators in their island. But now, because humans, when they discovered this island, when they explored it, they brought all these creatures with them that were not good for the dodo bird. And we hunted them as well, right, for food. Here's another one. Cool looking fish, right? These are called lionfish. They're from the Pacific, mainly like Southeast Asia, warmer waters around there. But we thought they looked cool, and they do, right? So we had them in aquariums and things like that, but then they eat fish, like a lot of fish, and fish that are really close in size to them as well. So they're not good for aquariums. They're the only fish that you can keep in the aquarium because they'll eat everything else. So eventually people got sick of them, and they're like, well, I feel bad killing it. So, they came from the ocean. I can just put it back in the ocean. So they did. In the Atlantic Ocean. They're from the Pacific Ocean. So now, in the Atlantic Ocean, off the coast of Florida, the Gulf of Mexico and everything, we have a huge population of lionfish that are just living out there, and they shouldn't be out there, and they're destroying ecosystems out there. The last threat to biodiversity, introduced diseases. Pretty straightforward. As humans move around, we also bring diseases with us. Not only do we bring animals, but those animals can also bring diseases with them. One of the biggest ones was the plague, right? That was basically from humans, and we brought animals with us. We brought the mice with us, and the mice had fleas that had the plague. That's where plague came from. Our last thing for this lecture is calculating biodiversity. There are two ways that we can also take a look at biodiversity. One, of course, we talked about species richness, how many different species are in an ecosystem. The next one is species evenness. The more abundant each species is, the more biodiversity there is. So we want not only a lot of species, but we want a good amount of each one and in an even ratio. Let's take a look at our next slide here. So we have two communities here. We have the same amount of trees in both communities, but in community 2, we only have mainly one type of tree, type A. And if you look, that makes up 80% of the tree population. Whereas the community on the left, that has the same amount of trees, but it has those different species of trees in a very evenly distributed population. That actually gives us more biodiversity. The community on the right, less biodiversity. The community on the left, more biodiversity. And that is the end of our notes. If you have any questions, feel free to make sure to either email me, send me a message on Remind, or Canvas. Thank you.